The radio crackled with static and desperation. Any station, this is Phantom 2-1. Troops in contact, danger close, requesting immediate close air support. The voice belonged to a SEAL team leader whose name would never appear in official reports, a man whose heart rate had stopped spiking 3 firefights ago. His team was pinned in a dried riverbed 20 kilometers inside hostile territory, surrounded by fighters who'd spent their entire lives learning to kill in terrain like this. The coordinates came through broken, repeated 3 times because the first 2 transmissions dissolved into the sound of automatic weapons fire. At Bagram Airfield, most pilots were already wheels up or refueling, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the flight line. The operations center buzzed with controlled chaos as radio operators tried to vector assets toward the crisis. Their voices professional but edged with the knowledge that men were dying while they shuffled aircraft assignments on computer screens. Then a transmission cut through the frequency clutter, calm as morning coffee. Phantom 2-1, this is Revenant 3-1, A-10, single ship, playtime 45 minutes carrying mixed ordnance. What's your situation? The voice carried a distinctive cadence, not quite southern but shaped by years in places where words got stretched out under big skis. In the operations center, 3 controllers glanced at each other. Revenant 3-1 wasn't supposed to be airborne. The pilot had just returned from a 6-hour combat patrol and logged barely enough crew rest to qualify for another sortie. Command hadn't authorized the launch, but here was that A-10 anyway, already inbound, because someone had been monitoring emergency frequencies during what should have been mandatory downtime. The SEAL team leader's response came fast. Revenant, we're taking fire from 3 sides, approximately 40 enemy fighters in hardened positions, grid follows. He rattled off 10-digit coordinates while rounds snapped overhead, close enough that his radio operator pressed himself flatter against rocks that offered no real protection. The A-10 pilot didn't acknowledge with standard brevity codes. Instead, copy your position. I'm 20 minutes out. Keep your heads down and mark your location with infrared. I'll sort it out when I get there. 20 minutes felt like 20 hours to men whose ammunition was becoming a mathematical problem. But something in that voice suggested competence beyond protocol, a pilot who'd done this before when everything went wrong. What nobody on the ground knew yet was that Revenant 3-1 flew with a call sign earned in blood, in a valley that still appeared in classified after-action reports, and that the pilot's given name was Kestrel Thornay Woman, who'd proven herself so thoroughly that her gender only got mentioned by people who hadn't flown with her. The A-10 Thunderbolt II sliced through Afghan airspace like a predator that had evolved for exactly this purpose. At 23,000 pounds, the aircraft looked wrong, almost ungainly, its twin turbofan engines mounted high on the fuselage above a titanium bathtub that surrounded the cockpit. The nose housed a 7-barrel GAU-8 Avenger, cannon capable of firing depleted uranium rounds at 70 per second, a weapon so powerful the entire aircraft had been designed around it. Under the wings hung a mix of Maverick missiles, Mark 82 bombs and rocket pods, everything needed to turn hardened positions into memories. Kestrel flew the jet with the kind of economy that came from 1,200 combat hours, her hands light on the stick, eyes constantly scanning the heads-up display and the terrain ahead. She'd already calculated fuel, distance, and engagement time. The math was tight but workable if she kept her speed efficient and her attacks precise. The SEAL team's situation was deteriorating in real time. 3 fighters had maneuvered close enough to throw grenades into the riverbed, forcing the Americans to shift positions under fire. The team medic was treating 2 wounded, his supplies running low, his hands steady despite the chaos. Their defensive perimeter had shrunk to barely 30 meters, a circle of desperate men who'd stopped thinking about extraction and started thinking about making their last stand expensive for the enemy. The team leader kept his voice level on the radio, updating any aircraft that might be listening, knowing that command would send a quick reaction force if they could, but help was still an hour away by helicopter. An hour they didn't have. The Taliban fighters knew it too, their fire becoming more aggressive, probing for weak points, calling to each other in Pashto as they coordinated their final assault. Kestrel's voice came back, closer now. Phantom 2-1, Revenant 3-1, I have visual on the valley. Confirm you're marked with IR. The SEAL team leader triggered his infrared strobe, a beacon visible only through night vision but readable in broad daylight by aircraft equipped with the right sensors. Strobing now, he transmitted, then to his team. Friendlies inbound, stay tight. The sound reached them before the visually distinctive whine of turbofans pushing through mountain air, different from the roar of fighter jets, lower and more deliberate. Then the A-10 appeared, dropping from 6,000 feet in a dive that looked almost lazy, its gray-green camouflage making it seem like part of the sky itself, until it was already committed to the attack run. Kestrel had oriented herself in seconds, identifying enemy positions by their muzzle flashes and the patterns of movement that separated trained fighters from panicked ones. Her first pass came in from the east, the A-10's nose dropping as she aligned the targeting pipper with a cluster of fighters positioned behind rocks. The GAU-8 erupted with a sound like ripping fabric amplified through a stadium, a BRRRT that resonated in chest cavities and shook dust from stone. 30mm rounds walked across the enemy position at 70 rounds per second, each one capable of punching through light armor, turning cover into fatal channeling points. The effect was instantaneous. Fighters scattered, some falling, others diving for deeper cover as the A-10 pulled up and banked hard left, already setting up for the next run. On the ground, the SEALs took advantage of the chaos, shifting positions, returning fire at targets now exposed and confused. The team leader's voice carried something close to relief. Good hits, Revenant, you just saved our lives. We've got more targets northeast, approximately 20 enemy in a compound. Kestrel's response was almost matter-of-fact. Copy, I see them. Coming around for Maverick employment. Keep your people clear of the compound. She banked the A-10 through a turn that bled airspeed but tightened her attack angle, lining up on the compound structure where thermal sensors showed concentrated heat signatures. The Maverick missile dropped from its rail with a punch of compressed air, its rocket motor igniting as it tracked toward the target using infrared guidance. The warhead impacted the compound center, the explosion sending a pressure wave that rattled windows in villages 3 kilometers away. When the smoke cleared, the compound was rubble, and the enemy fighters who'd been using it as a command post were gone, their assault broken before it could reach its conclusion. But Kestrel wasn't finished. She could see fighters retreating in vehicles, trying to disengage before they became her next target, and she dropped altitude to pursue them with the kind of focus that came from knowing what happened if she didn't. The operations center at Bagram had finally caught up with what was happening. A colonel stared at the tactical display showing Revenant 3-1's flight path, his expression caught between admiration and frustration. Who authorized this sortie? He asked, already knowing the answer was nobody. The air traffic controller pulled up the flight log. Sir, Captain Thorne self-launched after monitoring emergency traffic. She didn't wait for approval. The colonel rubbed his face, calculating the paperwork this would generate, then watched the tactical feed as Kestrel made another gun run that scattered a vehicle convoy attempting to flank the SEAL position. She's going to get written up for this, he said, but his tone suggested he knew exactly how that paperwork would resolve commendation, not reprimand, because results mattered more than protocol when Americans were dying. Get me a tanker airborne, extend her playtime, and get a CSAR bird spun up in case she takes damage. Kestrel felt the A-10 shudder as she rolled out from another attack, the airframe absorbing stress that would have torn apart a less robust aircraft. Her fuel gauge was already showing yellow, playtime shrinking faster than planned because combat maneuvering burned gas like water through a sieve. But the SEAL team was still in contact, still taking fire from positions she hadn't yet neutralized, and she'd made peace years ago with the idea that running out of fuel while saving lives was an acceptable outcome. She keyed the radio. Phantom 2-1, give me priority targets. I've got maybe 3 more runs before I'm Winchester. Winchester military jargon for out of ammunition, though she wasn't there yet, just planning ahead because planning kept you alive when improvisation got people killed. The SEAL team leader was already marking targets with a laser designator, painting a machine gun position that had been chewing up their perimeter since the fight began. The gun run came in low and fast, Kestrel dropping to 800 feet, low enough that she could see individual fighters scrambling for cover, their faces turning upward in the last second before the GAU-8 turned their position into a kill zone. The titanium bathtub surrounding her cockpit absorbed small arms fire she barely registered, pings and rattles against armor designed to take hits from anti-aircraft cannons and keep flying. The A-10 was built for exactly this close air support in contested airspace, flown by pilots willing to get dirty, to see the faces of the men they were saving and the men they were killing. She pulled up, checking her tactical display, counting enemy positions eliminated, calculating what remained. The math was turning favorable. The enemy assault was broken, fighters retreating in disarray, leaving their dead behind as they melted back into the hills. The SEAL team was battered but intact, their perimeter secure, extraction finally becoming a realistic option. Revenant, Phantom 2-1, enemy forces are retreating, you broke their back. We're calling an extract, ETA 30 minutes. The gratitude in the team leader's voice came through even in military brevity. Kestrel acknowledged, already thinking about fuel and recovery, the adrenaline that had been sustaining her starting to fade into the exhaustion of a pilot who'd been airborne for too many hours. She climbed to altitude, circling overhead, while the SEALs consolidated and prepared for helicopter extraction, her presence alone enough to keep enemy forces from attempting another assault. The Afghan sky was beginning its evening transition, light going golden at the edges, the mountains casting shadows that turned valleys into patchwork darkness. She'd seen this sky in every condition, flown through weather that grounded less capable aircraft, and come home each time because the A-10 was nearly indestructible, and she'd learned to treat it like an extension of her own body. The tanker met her halfway back to Bagram, a KC-135 that matched her speed and altitude while she plugged into the refueling boom, taking on enough fuel to make it home with reserve. The boom operator's voice crackled in her headset. "Heard you had an interesting afternoon, Revenant." She almost smiled, too tired to explain that interesting was a word people used when they hadn't been there, hadn't seen what happened when close air support arrived 30 seconds too late. "Something like that," she replied, disconnecting from the boom and banking toward home. Bagram appeared on the horizon, sprawling and busy, helicopters lifting off with the SEAL team that would never know the name of the pilot who'd saved them, never see her face, never understand that she'd launched without orders because listening to men die while waiting for approval wasn't something she could do anymore. She landed as the sun touched the mountains, the A-10's landing gear absorbing the impact with hydraulic efficiency, the aircraft slowing with the help of deployed air brakes. Ground crew swarmed immediately, checking for damage, finding bullet impacts in non-critical areas, the kind of wear that got logged and repaired and forgotten because combat damage was routine for aircraft built to survive it. Kestrel shut down the engines, running through post-flight checks with mechanical precision, her body finally registering the fatigue that had been building since she'd strapped in 8 hours ago. She climbed down from the cockpit, her flight suit dark with sweat, her face marked with the imprint of her oxygen mask, and found the operations colonel waiting on the tarmac. He studied her for a long moment. Captain Kestrel Thorne was 34, with dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun, eyes the color of storm clouds, and the kind of lean build that came from living on coffee and adrenaline. She'd been flying A-10s for 9 years, 3 deployments, more combat hours than pilots twice her age, and a reputation that preceded her in every unit she joined. The colonel knew her record, knew about the valley where she'd held off an enemy assault for 40 minutes while a rescue convoy fought its way to a downed helicopter crew, knew that her call sign Revenant meant something that returned from death, a name given by squadron mates who'd seen her bring a damaged aircraft home through weather that should have killed her. "You launched without authorization," he said, his voice carrying the weight of regulations and the reality of results. "Yes, sir," she replied, offering no excuses, no justifications. "I monitored emergency traffic and made a tactical decision." The colonel looked past her at the A-10, at the bullet impacts and empty weapons pylons, at the evidence of violence delivered with precision. "That tactical decision saved 8 American lives," he said. "It also violated crew rest protocols, launched unauthorized ordnance expenditure, and bypassed command approval." He paused, letting the weight of regulation settle between them. "I'm writing you up for both reprimand for the violations, commendation for the results. The paperwork will balance itself out, and next time you wait for approval." Kestrel nodded, knowing there wouldn't be a next time because next time she'd do exactly the same thing, and they both knew it. "Understood, sir," he almost smiled. "Go get debriefed, then get some sleep. You look like hell." She walked toward the operations building, her body moving on autopilot, already thinking about the debrief, the forms, the classified reports that would document the engagement and bury it in files that historians might read decades later. The SEAL team arrived back at Bagram 4 hours later, dusty and exhausted, their faces marked with the 1,000-yard stare that came from combat that got too close. The team leader, whose name was classified but whose gratitude was genuine, asked about the A-10 pilot, wanted to know who'd saved his team when command was still coordinating response options. An operations sergeant pulled up the sortie log, saw the pilot's name, and something shifted in his expression. "Revenant 31 is Captain Thorne," he said, emphasis on the name in a way that suggested gender mattered somehow. The SEAL team leader processed this information without visible reaction, his professional appreciation unchanged by irrelevant details. "She available for a thank you?" The sergeant shook his head. "She's already debriefed and off base, mandatory crew rest after double-cycle combat hours." That night, in temporary quarters that smelled of dust and jet fuel, Kestrel lay awake staring at ceiling tiles that all looked identical, her mind replaying the engagement in the analytical way pilots did, identifying moments where she could have been more efficient, attacks that could have been angled differently, ammunition she could have conserved. The room was standard deployment spare metal furniture, thin mattress, footlocker containing everything she owned in Afghanistan. On the small desk sat a photograph in a cheap frame, Kestrel at 23, fresh from flight school, standing beside her father who'd flown F-4 Phantoms in Vietnam, his expression proud and worried in equal measure. He died 6 years ago, heart attack, never got to see her become the pilot he'd trained her to be during childhood flights in his restored Cessna. She joined the Air Force partly because of him, partly because flying was the only thing that made sense in a world that often didn't. Sleep came eventually, fractured and filled with the sounds of gunfire and radio chatter, the kind of sleep that left you more tired than rested. She woke before dawn, muscle memory overriding exhaustion, and went through the routine of another day: physical training, briefings, maintenance checks, the endless cycle of military life punctuated by moments of violence that felt both extraordinary and routine. The squadron was already talking about yesterday's engagement, the story spreading in the way military stories did, details getting embellished and simplified simultaneously. Some pilots expressed admiration, others skepticism. A few made jokes about cowboys who launched without orders, but most recognized what she'd done and why it mattered. The A-10 community was small enough that reputation counted for everything, and Kestrel's reputation was solid among people who'd flown with her, questioned by those who hadn't. The squadron commander called her into his office 3 days later. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Wade was 47, a career A-10 pilot with silver hair, and the calm demeanor of someone who'd seen enough combat to stop being impressed by heroics and start caring about sustainability. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. the office decorated with squadron patches and photographs of aircraft from 30 years of service. Kestrel sat, her posture military correct, her expression neutral. Wade pulled up a classified report on his computer, scanning it briefly before speaking. Your engagement 3 days ago is getting attention at higher levels. The SEAL team you supported has submitted commendations. Command is pleased with the results but concerned about the precedent of self-launched sorties without approval. He paused, measuring his words carefully. You put me in a difficult position, Captain. She met his eyes. Yes, sir, I understand. Wade leaned back in his chair, studying her with the assessing gaze of a commander who had to balance mission effectiveness against regulatory compliance. Here's what's going to happen. Officially, you're being counseled about proper authorization channels and crew rest protocols. Unofficially, every pilot in this squadron knows they're alive today because someone like you is willing to break rules when it matters. He pulled out a formal letter, already signed and sealed. This is your Article 15 non-judicial punishment for unauthorized sortie launch. It goes in your file, stays there for 2 years, then gets removed if you stay out of trouble. He pulled out a second document. This is your Distinguished Flying Cross recommendation, submitted by both the SEAL team and myself, citing extraordinary heroism in combat. He set both documents on the desk between them. Your career just got more complicated. Kestrel looked at the paperwork, understanding what it meant. The Article 15 would follow her through promotion boards, a black mark that would require explanation. The Distinguished Flying Cross would open doors, proving she'd earned her place through combat effectiveness. The contradiction was pure military logic, punishment and recognition existing simultaneously because regulations and reality didn't always align. Thank you, sir, she said, meaning it. Wade nodded. You're a good pilot, Thorne. One of the best I've commanded, but you need to understand that you can't save everyone, and trying to will eventually break you. His voice carried experience, the wisdom of someone who'd learned hard lessons about the limits of individual action. The mission continues whether you're here or not, and the squadron needs you functional more than it needs you heroic. She wanted to argue, to explain that listening to radio calls from dying men wasn't something she could compartmentalize, that launching without orders had been the only moral choice available. But Wade had been flying combat when she was still in middle school, and his concern came from a place of professional respect, not doubt about her capabilities. Understood, sir, she said instead, taking the documents and standing. Is there anything else? He shook his head. Dismissed, and Thorne, stay alive. That's an order. She left his office carrying paperwork that would define the next phase of her career, walking past squadron mates who nodded or looked away depending on their opinions about what she'd done, and found herself standing on the flight line watching maintenance crews prep aircraft for evening sorties. The A-10s sat in their revetments like predators at rest, their distinctive profiles making them recognizable from kilometers away. Kestrel had flown this aircraft in conditions that terrified more cautious pilots, had learned its quirks and capabilities, until the machine felt like an extension of her own nervous system. The titanium bathtub that protected the cockpit, the redundant flight systems that kept flying even with half the aircraft shot away, the GAU-8 cannon that made the entire jet shudder when it fired, all of it designed for survival in hostile airspace, for pilots willing to get close enough to see what they were shooting. She'd fallen in love with the A-10 during flight training, recognizing in its brutal functionality a kind of honesty that matched her own approach to life. It wasn't elegant or fast or glamorous. It was effective, and effectiveness mattered more than aesthetics when lives hung in the balance. A crew chief approached, technical sergeant with 20 years of maintenance experience written in scars across his hands. Captain Thorne, got a minute? She turned, recognizing him from pre-flight briefings but not remembering his name, one of the necessary failures of memory when you worked with hundreds of personnel across rotating shifts. What's up, Sergeant? He gestured toward her A-10, the one she'd flown on the SEAL rescue mission, now repaired and refueled. Wanted you to see something. They walked to the aircraft together, and he pointed at the fuselage just below the canopy where someone had stenciled 8 small marks, each one representing a life saved. Crew did this last night. Unofficial, not in the maintenance logs, but we figured you'd earned it. Kestrel stared at the marks, understanding their meaning, feeling something complicated stir in her chest: gratitude, responsibility, the weight of expectations she hadn't asked for but would carry regardless. "Thank you, Sergeant," she said quietly. He nodded, professional satisfaction evident in his weathered face. "That bird's taken a beating, but she's sound. We pulled 8 rounds out of non-critical areas, patched some hydraulic lines, replaced a panel. She's ready for the next one." The next one there was always a next one in a deployment that measured time in missions rather than days. Each sortie another roll of dice that paid out in survival or became a statistic in casualty reports. Kestrel ran her hand along the fuselage, feeling rivets and panel seams, the physical reality of engineering designed to absorb violence and keep functioning. "Keep her flying, Sergeant. That's all I ask." He smiled slightly. "That's our job, ma'am. Keeping you alive is yours." She watched him walk back to the maintenance hangar, then stood alone beside the aircraft as evening descended, the Afghan sky turning colors that would have been beautiful if she'd had energy left to appreciate them. That night in the officers' club, a converted storage building with mismatched furniture and a bar stocked with near beer, because regulations prohibited alcohol, squadron mates gathered in the informal way military professionals did when off duty, their conversations mixing shop talk with the dark humor that helped process what they'd seen. Kestrel sat at a corner table with her flight lead, Captain Derek Moss, a Mississippi native whose slow drawl concealed a sharp tactical mind. "You caused quite the stir," he said, sipping from a can of non-alcoholic beer that tasted like regret. "Command doesn't know whether to promote you or ground you." She shrugged. "They'll split the difference, which is what they did." Moss laughed quietly. "That's the Air Force. Punish you for breaking rules while rewarding you for results, then act confused when pilots get mixed messages about initiative." He set down his drink, his expression turning serious. "For what it's worth, you did the right thing. Those SEALs would be dead if you'd waited for approval, and we both know it." Kestrel appreciated the support but also recognized the danger in setting precedents that encouraged reckless behavior. "Maybe," she said, "but Wade's right too. I can't launch every time I hear emergency traffic. There's a line between initiative and insubordination, and I walked right up to it." Moss considered this. "The line's not as clear as they pretend during safety briefings. Sometimes the only moral choice violates regulations, and that's when you find out what kind of officer you really are." He paused, choosing words carefully. "You know why they gave you the call sign Revenant?" She did, but let him tell it anyway because the story mattered to squadron identity. "3 years ago, you brought a shot-up A-10 back through weather that had grounded every other aircraft. Hydraulics failing, half your instruments dead, holes in the fuselage big enough to throw cats through. Any reasonable pilot would have ejected over friendly territory and let the bird crash. But you nursed it home because you knew maintenance could save the aircraft if you got it back, and aircraft don't grow on trees." He met her eyes. "That's when people started calling you Revenant, something that returns from death. It stuck because it's accurate. You don't quit when things go wrong, and that makes you valuable." Kestrel felt uncomfortable with praise, more comfortable with action than recognition. "I just did the job," she said, but Moss shook his head. "No, you did the job better than it's usually done, and there's a difference." The deployment ground on, days blending into weeks, each one marked by missions that varied in intensity but never in importance. Kestrel flew close air support for ground forces engaged in contested valleys, armed reconnaissance over routes where insurgents planted IEDs, and alert sorties where she circled overhead waiting for someone to need her. The work was exhausting and routine in equal measure, demanding constant vigilance without guaranteeing constant action. Some days passed without firing a shot, her presence alone enough to deter enemy activity. Other days became chaotic symphonies of violence where she expended every weapon aboard while ground forces fought for survival. She learned to read terrain like text, identifying ambush sites and escape routes, understanding how terrain shaped tactics and tactics shaped outcomes. The squadron developed rhythms, pilots rotating through mission cycles while building the kind of professional trust that kept people alive. Kestrel flew with different wingmen, each bringing their own strengths and quirks, learning to communicate in the abbreviated language of tactical radio calls that conveyed complex information in seconds. She earned respect not through speeches or posturing, but through consistent performance, through being the pilot others wanted overhead when situations deteriorated. Gender became irrelevant in a community that cared more about competence than demographics, though she remained aware that each mistake would be magnified by those looking for evidence that women didn't belong in combat aviation. The pressure was constant but manageable, converted into fuel that pushed her toward excellence rather than resentment. 3 months into deployment, intelligence reported increased enemy activity near a forward operating base where a marine company was conducting presence patrols. Kestrel was tasked with overhead alert, maintaining position within rapid response distance, while the Marines moved through villages known for insurgent sympathy. The morning started quietly, her A-10 circling at 12,000 feet, the Helmand River Valley spread below like a topographic map rendered in browns and greens. Radio traffic was routine position reports, status checks, the background noise of military operations proceeding according to plan. Then everything changed with a transmission that started calm and evolved into chaos within seconds. Any aircraft, this is Gator 16, troops in contact, were being ambushed from multiple positions, taking casualties, requesting immediate air support. Kestrel's response was instantaneous. Gator 16, Revenant 31, overhead your location, standing by for target coordinates. She'd already oriented her tactical display, finding the Marine unit's position marked on digital terrain, her hands running through weapons checks while her mind calculated attack angles and collateral damage parameters. The Marine lieutenant's voice carried the controlled urgency of someone trained to stay functional while bullets snapped past. Revenant were pinned in a compound, approximately 30 enemy fighters in surrounding buildings. Grid follows. He rattled off coordinates while Kestrel descended, dropping from safe altitude into the envelope where ground fire became a serious concern, trading safety for the visibility needed to identify targets without killing friendlies. At 8,000 feet, she could see the compound, could make out movement in adjacent structures, could begin building the tactical picture that would determine whether everyone went home or some went home in body bags. The Marines had walked into a well-planned ambush, enemy fighters occupying prepared positions with clear fields of fire covering all escape routes. The compound they'd taken refuge in was bullet-scarred and surrounded, offering protection from direct fire, but no way out. Kestrel could see muzzle flashes from 3 separate buildings, could track the coordinated nature of the assault, recognized this was experienced fighters executing a deliberate plan. Gator 16, Revenant has visual on your position. I'm seeing multiple threats in buildings northeast and northwest of your location. Confirm you're contained in the central compound. The lieutenant's confirmation came fast. Affirm, all friendly forces inside the compound. Everything outside is hostile. That simplified her decision-making significantly. Anything moving outside the compound became a legitimate target. Collateral concerns reduced to damaged buildings in a valley that had seen worse. Her first gun run came from the north, the A-10 diving at an angle that aligned the GAU-8 with a building where thermal sensors showed concentrated enemy activity. The cannon fired in a burst that lasted 3 seconds but felt like thunder, 30mm rounds punching through mud brick walls, ending resistance in that position with brutal efficiency. She pulled up and banked, already identifying the next target, her mind processing tactical data faster than conscious thought. The Marines took advantage of the chaos, shifting positions within their compound, returning fire at enemies now focused on the aircraft that had just demonstrated its lethality. Kestrel made another pass, this time from the east, delivering rockets that turned a fortified position into smoke and ruin. The ambush was collapsing, enemy fighters breaking contact as their positions became death traps, retreat becoming the only survivable option. But war rarely concluded neatly. As Kestrel climbed for altitude, her threat warning system activated with a tone that spiked her adrenaline missile launch, ground-based, tracking her aircraft. She reacted with trained instinct, deploying flares while throwing the A-10 into a dive that used terrain masking to break the missile's lock. The shoulder-fired missile corkscrewed past her position, close enough that she felt the A-10 shudder from its proximity, then detonated harmlessly against a hillside. The radio erupted with the Marine lieutenant's voice. "Revenant, confirm you're okay, we saw the missile." Her heart rate was already settling, adrenaline converting into focus. "I'm still flying, Gator. That position was northwest of your compound. You got eyes on the shooter." The Marines had indeed spotted the fighter who'd fired the missile, marked his position, and Kestrel made one more pass with the GAU-8, ending that particular threat in a way that ensured he'd never fire another missile at anyone. The engagement ended 20 minutes after it began, enemy forces scattered or dead, the Marine company extracted by helicopter before insurgents could regroup. Kestrel climbed back to altitude, her fuel gauge showing she'd burned through reserves faster than optimal but still had enough to make it home. The mission had been textbook close air support rapid response, accurate ordnance delivery, friendly forces preserved, enemy neutralized. The kind of mission that became a single line in operational summaries, but represented the difference between casualties and survival for the men she'd supported. She felt the familiar exhaustion that followed combat, the adrenaline crash that left her hands shaking slightly on the stick, and thought about the missile that had come too close, the seconds where training and luck conspired to keep her alive. Back at Bagram, maintenance crews found shrapnel embedded in the A-10's tail section, fragments from the missile's proximity detonation that had missed vital systems by meters. The crew chief showed Kestrel the damage, small punctures that looked insignificant but could have severed control cables if angled differently. "You got lucky," he said, professional assessment devoid of drama. "Missile came close enough that shrapnel penetrated the fuselage, but it missed everything important." Kestrel examined the damage, reaching out to touch the punctures, feeling the physical proof of how narrow the margin between survival and death could be. "Can you patch it?" The crew chief nodded. "We'll have her ready by tomorrow. Couple hours of work, some sheet metal, good as new." Good as new, the optimism of maintainers who'd spent careers keeping aircraft flying despite damage that should have grounded them permanently. The Marine lieutenant flew to Bagram 2 days later, ostensibly for coordination meetings but really to meet the A-10 pilot who'd saved his company. First Lieutenant Jake Ramirez was 26, from San Diego, possessed of the intensity that came from commanding infantry in combat zones. He found Kestrel in the operations building, working through flight plans for upcoming missions, and approached with the directness Marines were known for. "Captain Thorne, I'm Lieutenant Ramirez. My company's alive because of you." She looked up from her computer, processing the gratitude, uncomfortable with the attention but understanding why it mattered to him. "Just doing the job, Lieutenant. Glad it worked out." He shook his head slightly. "It's more than that. We'd walked into a planned ambush, they'd been waiting for us, and we were about to get chewed up. You showed up and dismantled their whole operation." They talked for 20 minutes, comparing perspectives on the engagement, Ramirez describing what it looked like from the ground while Kestrel explained the aerial view, how targets appeared through sensors and optics, how she'd prioritize threats based on their capabilities and positions. The conversation had the quality of professionals comparing notes, each gaining insight into the other's world. "Your guys on the ground do the hard part," Kestrel said. "I just provide support from altitude where nobody's shooting directly at me." Ramirez laughed. "Except for that missile that nearly got you. My radio operator saw it launch, thought you were done. Then you jinked out of the way like you'd practiced the maneuver 1,000 times." She had practiced it in simulators and training flights, preparing for scenarios that hopefully would never happen but sometimes did. "Training works," she said simply. "That's why they make us do it." Before leaving, Ramirez mentioned something that stuck with her. "The Marines in my company come from all over different backgrounds, different beliefs, different everything. But after that engagement, they've all got one thing in common. They believe in the A-10 and they believe in you. When we're on patrol and hear that cannon, we know someone's got our back. Kestrel felt the weight of that trust, the responsibility that came with being the aircraft others counted on when everything went wrong. "Tell your Marines to stay safe," she said. "I'd rather be bored overhead than busy making gun runs." Ramirez nodded, understanding the sentiment. "That makes two of us." They shook hands, the brief physical contact sealing a connection forged in combat, the kind of bond that transcended service branches and would persist long after the deployment ended. The deployment entered its final months, the timeline counting down toward rotation home. Kestrel had flown 97 combat missions, expended hundreds of rounds and dozens of missiles, supported ground forces from every service branch in situations ranging from routine to desperate. The missions blended together in memory, individual engagements losing their distinctiveness, except for moments that burned themselves into permanent recall: the near-miss missile, the SEAL team rescue, a convoy ambush where she'd arrived seconds before a catastrophic outcome. She'd learned to compartmentalize, to process experiences without letting them consume her, to maintain the emotional distance that kept pilots functional across multiple deployments. But the weight accumulated anyway, each mission adding to a burden she carried without acknowledging, the cost of doing a job that required bearing witness to violence and occasionally delivering it. The squadron threw a deployment end party, alcohol-free but celebratory nonetheless, pilots and ground crew gathering to mark the conclusion of 6 months in Afghanistan. Stories circulated, getting embellished with each retelling, the squadron's collective memory building mythology from missions that had seemed routine at the time, but gained significance in retrospect. Kestrel found herself at the center of several stories, her call sign invoked with respect that made her uncomfortable, her combat hours cited as evidence of dedication, beyond standard requirements. She deflected attention when possible, redirected praise toward ground crews and tactical controllers, tried to maintain the low profile that matched her personality. But the squadron had adopted her as something between mascot and standard-bearer, a pilot whose competence validated the entire community's sense of purpose. Lieutenant Colonel Wade pulled her aside during the party, his expression serious despite the celebratory atmosphere. "You're getting orders after leave," he said without preamble. "Pentagon wants you for a cross-service liaison position, coordinating close air support doctrine between Air Force and ground components." Kestrel processed this information, recognizing both the opportunity and the trap. Liaison positions offered career advancement but removed pilots from cockpits, trading flight hours for conference rooms and PowerPoint presentations. "I'd rather stay operational, sir," Wade nodded, having anticipated the response. "I told them that, but your combat record makes you valuable for doctrinal development, and turning down the assignment would be career limiting." The phrase carried weight. Career limiting meant stalled promotions, reduced opportunities, eventually separating from service or accepting mediocrity. "How long is the assignment?" Wade's face suggested he knew she wouldn't like the answer. 3 years with possible extension." 3 years away from flying meant losing currency, losing the edge that kept her competitive, potentially never returning to operational status. Kestrel felt anger rising, carefully suppressed because showing emotion to a commanding officer rarely improved situations. "Is there any way to decline respectfully?" Wade's expression softened slightly. "Not without consequences. But here's what I can offer: take the assignment, perform well, and I'll personally advocate for your return to operational flying afterward. Pentagon assignments look good on promotion boards, and you'll make contacts that matter later in your career." The logic was sound, the path forward clear even if she hated it. "Understood, sir. When do I report?" Wade provided details for weeks of leave after returning stateside, then on to Washington for an assignment that would test her patience more than her flying skills. The flight home was commercial chartered, A civilian 747 packed with personnel rotating out of theater, the interior modified to carry troops instead of tourists. Kestrel sat in a middle seat between two Army specialists who slept through most of the flight, exhaustion overcoming discomfort, their young faces slack with the relief of having survived deployment. She stared out the window when position allowed, watching Afghanistan disappear below, its mountains and valleys holding stories that would never be fully told, lives changed or ended in places too remote for anyone back home to find on maps. The country had been her workplace for 6 months, had tested her skills and resolve, had taken pieces of her emotional capacity that wouldn't return even after she landed in the continental United States. Combat changed people in ways both obvious and subtle, stripping away illusions while reinforcing the importance of competence and trust. Landing at Dover Air Force Base felt surreal: clean air, green grass, buildings that weren't fortified against attack. The transition from combat zone to home station always carried disorientation, the pace of life slowing to speeds that felt wrong after months of sustained intensity. Kestrel processed through demobilization in a daze, completing medical screenings and administrative requirements with mechanical efficiency, her mind still operating on Afghanistan time even as her body adjusted to a different hemisphere. She called her mother from a borrowed phone, the conversation brief because there wasn't much to say. She was safe, she was home, she'd visit soon. Her mother cried anyway, relief and worry mixing in the way mothers experienced when their children returned from war zones, and Kestrel felt guilty for causing that pain even while knowing she'd make the same choices again. 4 weeks of leave passed too quickly. She spent time with family in Colorado, where her mother lived in the house Kestrel had grown up in, every room filled with memories of a childhood that felt distant and foreign. She visited her father's grave, standing alone at the headstone that listed his name and rank, and the wars he'd fought, talking to him the way she had when he was alive, updating him on missions he'd have understood because he'd flown his own version of them decades earlier. She hiked mountains because physical exertion helped process the accumulated stress of deployment, pushing herself until exhaustion replaced thought, until she could sleep without dreaming about radio calls and gun runs and near misses. The leave was necessary but felt like suspension, time existing between one phase of her career and another, neither fully deployed nor fully home. Reporting to the Pentagon was like entering an alien world. The building sprawled across acres, its corridors labeled with cryptic numbering systems, its offices filled with officers whose combat experience varied from extensive to non-existent. Kestrel's new assignment placed her in a doctrine development cell tasked with improving coordination between airborne assets and ground forces, translating combat lessons into training protocols and tactical procedures. The work was important but frustrating, each recommendation requiring approval from multiple layers of bureaucracy, each improvement debated by committees whose members had never called in close air support while under fire. She attended meetings that could have been emails, wrote reports that would be filed and forgotten, and felt her flying skills atrophy while she argued about terminology in doctrine manuals. But the assignment had unexpected benefits. She worked alongside officers from multiple services, learning how Marines conceptualized air support differently than Army units, understanding Navy perspectives shaped by carrier aviation constraints, absorbing tactical philosophies from Special Operations Command, where innovation mattered more than standardization. The exposure broadened her understanding of joint operations, gave her insights into how bureaucracy actually shaped battlefield capabilities, taught her that influence sometimes required navigating office politics rather than flying perfect missions. She made connections with colonels and generals whose decisions would affect thousands of service members, planted seeds for future improvements even when immediate changes proved impossible. The work wasn't what she'd chosen, but she approached it with the same competence she applied to flying, because half-hearted effort violated her principles. 18 months into the Pentagon assignment, she received an email from Derek Moss, now a major, still flying A-10s from a base in Arizona. The message was brief. Thought you want to know the SEAL team you saved nominated you for the Silver Star. It got upgraded from the Distinguished Flying Cross based on additional testimony about the tactical situation. Ceremony scheduled for next month if you can attend. You earned it, Revenant. Kestrel read the message 3 times, processing the information, feeling complicated emotions about recognition for actions that had seemed necessary rather than heroic. The Silver Star ranked high among Valor Awards, testimony to extraordinary gallantry in combat, the kind of decoration that appeared in official biographies and shaped how others perceived your career. She'd never sought medals, measuring success in missions completed and lives saved, but understood that recognition mattered to others even if it felt uncomfortable to her. The ceremony took place at Joint Base Andrews, conducted with military formality that felt both appropriate and excessive. The citation described her actions during the SEAL rescue mission in detail, launching without authorization, flying through enemy fire, delivering precision strikes that saved 8 American lives while wounded and low on fuel. The actual medal was surprisingly small, a gold star suspended from a ribbon combining red,